This podcast is a Uniting Heart and Soul production. Hello and welcome back to Filthy Hope, a podcast where we dive into the grey spaces where Jesus and culture intersect. This week we're continuing our look into spaces of sexuality and intimacy in part 5 of our series Love, Sex and Jesus, with a conversation about abortion. First, we'll be hearing from Rev Ness as she talks about her past experiences, and then later on we're going to hear a conversation I had with Ness's daughter, Ginger, who's both a lawyer and an American-Australian dual citizen, to try and break open some of the nuance going on in the discourse around the Roe V Wade case in the States. We do obviously have to warn you, this episode contains the usual swearing warning, but also that we're going to be talking about abortion and other traumatic material very openly, so please keep that in mind. As you'll discover as you listen to our conversations, we as a church organisation and as individuals aren't trying to promote for or against abortion in any moralistic way by releasing these conversations in a podcast format. The most important thing for us is actually that we just listen to each other and show grace to each other while being radically honest. So bearing all of that in mind, we hope that this episode is helpful for you and your communities, whatever your experiences or opinions are. I'll see you on the other side. Hey Ness, how are you?
Hey, I'm okay. I'm a bit stressed about this topic today.
Yeah, it's a big one. We're, as I'm sure listeners already know, based on the intro, but we're going to be talking about abortion. We're actually going to be talking specifically about the recent Roe v Wade overturning. But we're going to leave that to later on in the podcast where we're going to talk to a lawyer about it and get their perspective on it. We are going to talk about it in a much more conversational way. And Ness, you're going to share
I am.
your story.
Yep.
So that's where we're headed for this episode.
I think that's why I feel stressed.
Yeah. But first, this might get some stress, let off some steam. Ness, what's grinding your gears? Let's stop by at Van Central first.
Make the music happen now, Jonty.
Yeah.
Okay, so I've just started my master's in theology and the census day hasn't hit yet, so I can still pull out if I want to. And I've got all this reading to do and I'm pretty excited about it, the reading, except that I'm having these moments of feeling absolutely thick as a brick because I can sit down and do, 40 pages of a reading, which could probably take a normal person, 2 hours to smash through. It's taking me double the time, Jonty, because I have to sit there with my phone and I have to Google what 60% of the bloody words mean. So I'm sitting there totally confused. And when you're having to Google what a word means and then I write it gently into the document, because I still print stuff out because I have to.
Of course.
I have to
I'm
work
the same.
that way.
Yeah.
I have to highlight, I've got to write it in and then I have to go back and reread it again and see if that scans better with the new word that I've put in to replace the big fancy word.
Yeah.
And by the end of it, I get to the end of the document and I think, what is that shit all about anyway? You know? And why do these academics write in such a way that it is so convoluted and complex? Are they out trying to outwank one another with the fancy language? Can you imagine, Jonty, if they just wrote these fabulous documents, and they're amazing, they say some incredible things, but if they put it into a simpler language, more people might be wanting to engage with the material.
Yeah.
I would imagine.
Totally.
It grinds my gears, man.
Yeah, and for people that don't know, I'm a English major, so I spent 4 years at university studying English and literature, and I got to tell you, it's not just theology. The thing that really shits me about it sometimes, though, is that you get young writers like myself going through university that take away from the readings that are offered, which invariably are incredibly useful. Like you say, there's amazing content in them. They're chosen for the course for a reason. But then think that when applying that to their own writing, that means that they have to hit this lofty level of prose that is just like borderline unreadable. Like it makes sense if you're an academic that's like been writing in that style and that form of prose for years and years and years and years and years. But when you've got a 19-year-old fresh out of high school that's then trying to write academic literature like in that style of writing,
And I'm expected to put these 3,000 word essays together, and I'm struggling just to understand the content at the moment. And I've got a pretty smart family. I've got a lawyer daughter, I've got a speech pathologist daughter, and I've got a PhD husband, and none of them want to help me and engage with the material because they reckon the words suck also. So it's like, oh dear. And Aurora just says to me, she's the speechy, she says, Mum, you'll get with it. Just stick with it, Mum. You'll eventually understand and it'll all make sense. Oh, bring that day on, I say.
Yeah, you do start to, like your ear does start to attune to the language and the level of delivery. But it's I feel you on that. I feel you.
Jesus be with me in the reading of this stuff, because I want to engage, because it's really interesting. But it would be so much more interesting if I actually understood it the first time I read it.
Yeah. I find often it's also like there's the one thing of you got to get your I can't talk, the thesaurus. There we go. You got to get the thesaurus out to understand what that word is, and you look at it and go, oh, why didn't you just
say that?
Exactly. The other thing that often I find is it's like this game that they play where they're like, how can I make this 1 or 2 sentence long clause as convoluted as possible? Like, how can I twist it around? How can I move the subject of the sentence around to make it, you kind of get to the end and there's 2 sets of brackets and an ellipsis, blah, blah, blah. And you get to the end, you're like, hang on, I have to go back and reread that sentence because I don't know what the point of that sentence, I understand that there's content there, but for whatever reason, this sentence is written by someone who doesn't know how to structure sentences.
Man, this is where I'm at right now. Yeah, it's doing my head in. Yeah. Anyway, I'm just praying that I get to the census date and continue on, because I'm struggling, man. Yeah,
and it's a balance. You don't want everyone to write like Dan Brown, where it's just like lowest common denominator.
No. Is he the lowest common denominator?
Oh, don't get me started. Have you read the Da Vinci Code?
Yes, parts of it.
Oh.
Okay, another podcast.
We won't get into it, but like, talk about a poorly written novel.
Oh, is it easy to understand though?
It's beyond that. It's Dan Brown, and I'm sorry for calling Dan Brown, as if Dan Brown listens to our podcast, but like, it's as if no one's ever explained to Dan Brown what the internal monologue is. So you have novels where you have direct access to what people think, but people just say everything out loud, as if. And you're kind of going, so someone's explaining something to another person, and you kind of verbally, and you're sitting there reading, going, aren't these people experts? Don't they already know this? Why are they talking?
They're external processes, Jonty.
Yeah, it just so poorly. Anyway, we're not going to talk about the Da Vinci Code. Well, thanks for sharing. That grinds. That you've re-ground my gears about academic writing, because I haven't thought about that since I left uni. But
you're not interested in your masters?
Oh, of course I am, but yeah, we'll talk about that another time.
I feel better. Thanks for listening.
Got that off your chest?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. Well, let's change direction
Yeah.
and let's dive in. As I'm sure future Jonty will already have covered, this is a confronting topic.
Yeah.
So again, if at any point listening you feel uncomfortable, you're under no obligation to keep listening. If anything is making you feel uncomfortable, just look after yourselves. But we're going to talk about abortion. And up front, we want to say that we're not coming at it from a judgy point of view. We're not here to cast judgment or shame or stand behind any particular moral ground.
Or even discuss the ethics.
Totally. What we are going to do, Ness, and I'll throw over to you now, is talk about your story.
Yeah. So I just also want to say, if you have had an abortion and this is going to trigger you, because I'm going to use real language, I'm radically honest in the way I tell my story, definitely tune out right now, as Jonty said. And in the show notes, we'll have a whole bunch of information on there if you need to seek counselling or get support.
Of course.
Because there's lots of great places you can go to. Well, I wasn't a Christian. I was 21 years old. I'd been on the pill since I was about 14, but I hadn't had sex till I was nearly 18, and I was in a loving relationship with a man when I had sex for the first time. And that relationship lasted quite a number of years. And then I'm now 21 and I was starting to unravel a bit, starting to deal with my child abuse and in the background of my brain. And I was acting out. I was drinking heavily. I was partying heavily. And I was somewhat promiscuous at the time. I found myself one night in a nightclub with a girlfriend and just drank too much, ended up back at a boy's house and ended up having sex with him. And I wish... I didn't know him. He was just a random stranger, which was an unusual thing for me to do. That was not in my normal MO. I usually had sex within the confines of loving relationships. And I just was risk-taking, I think, on this occasion. And it was really interesting because as I think back to the experience, I even remember where I was sitting, so it was really impactful for me. And I remember him saying to me, "Do you want to just masturbate?" And I remember in that moment being so shocked that anybody would say that to me, that it was almost quite repulsive and triggering for me. And I don't think at the time I realised the deep trauma that I felt from actually touching myself. Because as a child, and I've shared this in a previous podcast, a part of my child abuse was when one of the people that abused me took my hand and inserted my little hand into my vagina. So I didn't have happy memories about touching myself or anything to do with my private parts, quite frankly. So for this guy to say to me, "Let's just masturbate," was almost more abusive to me in my psyche and my brain at the time than actually doing penis in vagina. And I remember encouraging him, because I was too scared to do masturbation, to do P&V, as I'll call it. And so I remember it being a non-memorable event, and I was just glad it was done. The deed was done, and I remember just going home. Driving drunk home. That was probably the worst offence, driving drunk home. And I remember it being unprotected sex as well. I remember it being fast, over, just get the hell out of there. And shame around it. And I think the shame was more about the conversation around masturbation than it was actually about penis in vagina. Anyway, waiting for my period to come, and it doesn't come. I get anxious about it and talk to my mum about it. Mum says, well, in those days, you need to go to the doctor and have a blood test. Had a blood test to confirm, and I remember I was off teaching aerobics at night, came home at 9:30 at night after my class, get into the house, Mum and Dad are in bed, and I walk in the house and Mum says, I heard from doctor, you're pregnant. And I remember exactly where I was. I was in the hallway and I just froze. I said, I'm pregnant. And she said, yep, you're pregnant. And I walked to her door. She didn't turn the light on. She didn't give me a hug. She didn't give me any empathy at all. She just said, don't worry about it. I know what to do. We'll sort that out tomorrow. I'll get you an appointment with a gynecologist. You can have an abortion. I remember going into a freeze-style response to the conversation and not knowing what to do, being frozen, yet hysterical in my brain, yet frozen. But I don't remember any warmth from her or any empathy in and around the situation, which probably helped lead to the shame that I felt, because I felt her shame around this. And I don't remember my dad ever speaking to me about it either. You know, not the kind of thing that I could imagine I'd say to my kids, don't worry, babe, well, let's talk this through. What decision would you like to make? Let's let the dust settle in the morning. I just think of how I would mother my own daughters if this had been a thing. I remember Mum really taking control of the situation, probably because I was struggling to take control, so to her credit, she took control there for me. After shit slamming the fact that she didn't give me any empathy, she did take control of the situation for me. Sorry, Mum. And I remember then going and seeing the gynecologist, and I remember Mum giving me a pep talk in the car. Now, she's a solicitor, and I remember her saying, now you need to make sure that you tell him that you wouldn't cope with this pregnancy, and you need to convince him that this is something you definitely want to have happen because of your mental health and you're not going to cope. And I remember going, okay, I don't want this child. I don't want to be pregnant. This is not something I would cope with. I'm not going to have to pretend. That's how I feel. I don't want to be having a child. I can't do this. So we go in there and he asks me the questions and I tell him that I wouldn't cope and it was an accident, and he was quite clinical about it. I don't even remember having a physical examination that day. We just signed some paperwork and he got me booked in to have a surgical procedure, a surgical abortion. So no medication leading up to it, just booked into the hospital, little private hospital, and in my area to have the abortion. I never spoke to anybody about it. I don't even remember telling my best friends about it. I remember actually lying about it and I had to take days off work and telling people that I had cysts on my ovaries and that I was going in to have those taken care of. And that was why I was having a hospital procedure. And then then I remember, and it happened very quickly. So I would have been maybe 6 weeks pregnant, I would imagine, at the time. By that stage, I'd only just missed a period, and we got onto it really quickly, within days. And by the next week, I was booked in for the procedure. And I remember that day. I remember Mum coming with me and being around the bed. It was like I was treated like I was sick. I was sick, in hospital. And I remember feeling so alone. I remember being prepped for it, and they're wheeling me onto I could have walked in, mate. There was nothing wrong with me, And I was only pregnant. I could have walked into the operating theatre, but they lay you on a gurney in the day and then up with the side bits. And I remember being prepped for it. And I remember crying as they're wheeling me out of the room, heading to the operating theatre. And I remember the nurse at the end of the bed conferring with another nurse who was at my head, near my head, and saying, procedure, empty contents of uterus. It was that clinical, and I remember laying there hearing that, going, empty contents of uterus. I've got contents in my uterus. And that's how they talked about ending this life. Just empty the contents of the uterus. I remember crying, and the nurse saying to me, darling, you'll be okay. Do you want to do this? And I said yes. So she was like getting a verbal consent from me, but she showed me such empathy. I remember that in the moment, being very disturbed. She said, it's really important that you don't cry now. We need your airways to be clear. And blowing my nose, and then I don't remember anything after that until I woke up and it was all over. I just remember my tummy feeling internally like it was not in a good space, and I knew that some action in my vagina had taken place, and because I just felt tender, like an internal tenderness. I don't even think I spent the night there. I think I probably came home later that day or that night. I remember Mum tucking me into bed and caring for me. Actually, she cared for me in that moment, and I remember being quite dissociative and not plugged into reality and what was happening. So it wasn't a great experience. I feel there's a couple of things about it and that is privilege, that I live in a world where that was allowed to happen, in a country where that was allowed to happen, and that it was my choice for that to happen, and that I was able to afford for that to happen. But it doesn't take away, so that cleaned up that mess in my life at that time, and I don't remember talking about it much after that. It's not like something that you would talk about at a dinner party or chat with friends about. It's not a great event. It's something that's shrouded in shame. Even though 1 in 4 women in Australia will have an abortion at some time in their life. 1 in 4 people, Jonty, women. It's pretty scary, those stats. And yet there's still a real shame culture around this. For whatever reason, you have an abortion. And I find that I can understand why, because it's intrinsically, it doesn't feel like a good thing to do. It's not like going to the dentist and having your teeth cleaned or having even a tooth extraction, something removed from your body that will make you cope better because you're in no longer any pain. It's not like that. It's not like anything else, because there's some deep knowing that what you're doing is not a great thing.
I think that's really important to understand. And I want to say real quick, like, knowing full well as a male, any opinion I might have in this might as well essentially be null and void, because I'm never going to need to have an abortion. But having said that, the argument that I see from pro-life, that side of the argument, it's more this idea that pro-choice people are treating abortion like contraception, that it's this kind of flippant, doesn't matter, it's just like a morning after pill, is just not true.
No.
The idea that people that are arguing for women's abortion rights feel positively about abortion is not true.
No.
And your story highlights exactly that.
I think the worst part is, Jonty, that at 25, I was then married, I was happily married, and I started unravelling. I started having therapy, and I went into therapy to deal with the abortion. I was really screwed up because of this decision that I had made. And I had regret and trauma, and it just fed into everything. Every childhood upset just started to pour out with that. And the interesting thing is, there's not a year that doesn't go by where I don't remember. There's a couple of anniversaries. When I fell pregnant and when I had the abortion. They're two significant dates. Ask my family, I go into a bit of a meltdown. And those 2 times in the year, because they're grief anniversaries for me. These aren't happy days that I go, oh, let's crack a champs. I'm really glad I killed a life here. This is grief anniversary for me. Bad shit happened for me that day. I made a decision that impacted my life for eternity. And I impacted a life for eternity. I don't feel fucking good about that. And anybody who talks about abortion lightly, like women take it lightly, like it's just something we can rock up and do because that'll be a good thing to do that day, is uninformed.
Yeah.
And lacks empathy. And particularly men who cast judgment, I think. You know, the whole idea of the process of laying on a bed with your legs up in stirrups, completely vulnerable, with a speculum being put into your vagina then getting cranked open so that they can insert instrumentation into you to then vacuum out the contents of your uterus. I think for a man to make a comment when the biggest thing he's put into an orifice in his life is either an apple or a banana or a piece of fucking meat, I think, you know, fuck off is how I feel about that.
Hard agree.
Yeah, sorry, Jonty, I probably shouldn't have said any of that. But
no, I agree.
It pisses me off.
I agree.
You know, I remember, here's a little digression. I've got to kind of go funny because it's gone a bit heavy. I remember when COVID first started and people were going off for the PCR test for the very first time. A gentleman in my, somebody that I know very well, came back. He was the first person to have a PCR test. And he came back and he said, I said, how did it go, mate? And he said, Ness, I've been totally violated. And I said, oh my God, shit, what happened, mate? Run me through process. He said, well, they got this cotton bud and they put it up my nose and they twirled it around a couple of times and it went so far deep up my nose, it hurt.
Tickled my brain.
Yeah. And I thought to myself, oh my God, yeah, that's the biggest thing you've had up your nose. Try having a penis shoved down your throat.
Well,
you know?
Yeah, fundamentally the male heterosexual idea of what sexuality is. I don't think about this often. I was about to say I think about this all the time. I don't. I've been thinking about it recently in preparation for this. Like, just the concept of what sex is and the idea of receiving as opposed to giving,
Yeah.
I can only imagine must be so different, like at a fundamental level. And so, yeah, the idea of insertion in any capacity in a heterosexual male setting is super confronting, right?
Yeah.
But from a female perspective, welcome to my life, mate, you know? Like,
yeah. And we're men, and I think men think because they insert penises into vaginas, therefore it must be fun and it must be a great thing to do, and therefore women must like it. I'm sorry. A metal speculum in your vagina and cranked open, what's not there to like there about that? Come on. When men complain about going and having a prostate examination, they can't even handle the doctor's gloved finger inserted into their rectum for a minute of less than a minute into their poor little bot and a wiggle around to check what's happening at with their prostate. I just think, no, back off, mate. Don't even comment. You don't know.
Yeah, it's you're not equipped to make a judgment call on something like that. Casting aside even the basic ideas of bodily autonomy and just having basic control over what you do with your own body, which is is just non-negotiable, right? Any form of dictating what another person does with their body, call it whatever you want, it's just not on.
Yeah.
Especially from whenever we're going to talk about Roe v Wade shortly with our guest, but like whenever I see a new abortion law passed, and one of the recent ones, there was some state in the US passed a new law. It seems to happen all the time, and they show a photo of the cabinet that voted on it.
Yeah.
And it's all just white dudes.
Yeah.
Like middle-aged to old white dudes, and I just think, in what world are we living in?
Frightening, right?
Where men can decide what women can and can't do with their bodies. I know that that's controversial to say in some Christian circles, which frightens me even more. The idea that God condones anyone, but especially men, to pass judgment and exert control over women and what they do with their bodies is just horrendous. Blows my mind.
Can I just take a minute to talk about the shame and guilt and pain?
Please do, yeah.
So this event happened in my life and I made that decision, and it has eternal consequences for me. It's an ongoing pain point in my life. It doesn't ever get any better. I'm 55 and it happened at 21. You do the math. That's a long time ago. Aren't you over it, love? No, I'm not over it. Because what I did was I ended up a life at that point. And the shame and the guilt that I feel about that, Jonty, is I'll take that to my grave. And even though I'm saved by the blood of Christ, and I'm a Christian now, and I have taken that to the foot of the cross, I still tend to pick it up from his cross occasionally and put the backpack on and walk around with it for a bit.
We all do.
Yeah,
we all do.
I tend
at
to
different
do
points.
that.
Yeah.
And I think, and like our guest last week, Alison said, Jesus said, hey, give me back my stuff. I think I pick it up occasionally and just sit in it and re-feel the shame and re-feel the pain linked with that. So, and I don't think women see this as a light subject. I think the fact that I've never heard a woman talk about her abortion experience in a dinner party or a casual fleeting conversation, it's not stuff that we all share with each other, because I think there's an intrinsic feeling of pain and shame associated with what happened, how it happened, and potentially and the outcome and the decisions that we made. And I'm just so grateful that as a Christian woman who has made many terrible mistakes, this is one of many fucked up things I've done in my life, I'm just so grateful that Jesus died for me so that I can have salvation and life everlasting, just like anybody else who has done horrible things in their life and has a sense of shame and guilt and sin, I suppose, as we call it in Jesus land.
As a bit of a thought experiment,
Yeah.
I wonder if I could ask you to think about what would have happened in two alternative situations. First of all, if you were in that situation and didn't have access to safe medical abortion, but were in that position where it was in your mind necessary to carry that through. Like, I can only even begin to empathize with like the fear that then plays into it.
I don't think my mental health would have, if I'd had to carry out that pregnancy, I don't think I would be here today.
Which that was the second option is.
I don't think I would be here, Jonty. I think I would have, I probably, I don't think I had the mental capacity to do life and to raise a child. I was already a fucked up child having a child, and that wasn't going to end well for me or that kid. And then I also think about, I wouldn't have had my two daughters and I wouldn't be married to Rob if I hadn't done that. If I hadn't had that abortion, I would never have married Rob. And I think, wow, I wouldn't have had my two precious girls. And I look at what they're doing in their life and the impact that they're having in the world. I think, wow, I think God had a plan all along, you know?
Yeah, which I hope just illustrates to our listeners that it's not this black and white, easy decision either way.
No.
It is case to case.
Yeah.
It is always case to case.
Yeah. It hurts.
Yeah.
It's a constant hurt. And I think I'd love to hear from other women to see what their experiences are like and if they feel similarly, you know.
Yeah. So I feel very strongly that when we have this discussion about abortion, when we come at it from a purely ethical or ideological standpoint, we're never going to reach any sort of person-to-person connection, right? And you just have to look at any video of people outside abortion clinics screaming at each other, right? And something that someone said to me recently, might actually be listening, you'll know who you are in a sec if you are, that when we see or hear or read, wherever it is, discussion/argument between pro-choice and pro-life parties on either side of that spectrum, one is a women's rights issue and one is a human rights issue. And so automatically there's no middle ground. And those two arguments, they're arguing about two different things. Yeah. And so there's no way to even begin that conversation and open it up to actually discussing and potentially coming to some sort of amicable understanding. So I guess, and I hope that what this episode is plays into this, but the idea of, well, let's learn about it through hearing stories and through experience. And I think this idea that there's a black and white idea of whether abortion should or shouldn't happen and under what circumstances is ridiculous, right? And through hearing stories about other people, that's when we can learn to empathize and learn to see this as something that is incredibly complicated. never as straightforward as, men. I'm going to throw you all under the bus, us all under the bus again. Never as straightforward as men seem to think it is. So I think, really important. And if people, I guess to open that up more to other people, there are two movies that I've seen in particular that have been more informative to me in this space than any article or any piece of legislation or any whatever. One of which is called 4 months, 3 weeks and 2 days, and one of which is called Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always. I'll link both of them in the show notes. Both of which are about very intimate, closed off stories about young women travelling across state lines to get an abortion because they're unable to in their current location.
And was she 16 weeks pregnant? Is that what that is? The 4 months? Yes, that the 4 months, 3 weeks and 2 days is the length of the pregnancy. Nearly 20 weeks.
Yeah. So that they're both, I think they're both on Netflix. I don't actually know. I'd have to. But I would just, they're just two examples that I would encourage people, instead of just, opening their mouth and letting off their opinion. I mean, side note, dudes, you need to shut the fuck up on this one. It's really not up to you. I'm sorry, but let's learn to listen and hear and empathise and make decisions that have impacts on our own behaviour, not other people's, but make decisions based on our own behaviours that are going to be best to, encourage positivity and love. And I think you talked about the shame. I think I can only imagine how much of that comes from the cultural and the cultural ideas of what abortion and pregnancy means that has, let's be honest, been imposed largely by men.
And I wonder if the same shame happens if you miscarry a child at 6 weeks, which I've also done.
I wanted to bring this up, so I'm glad you brought this up as well. And miscarriage is just as taboo. Like, you don't hear women talking about their miscarriage at a dinner table either.
No, women keep that very much to themselves also.
There's a documentary, I don't know if you've heard of this doco called Misunderstandings of Miscarriage, I think is what it's called.
I haven't seen that.
I wish I could remember her name. She's an Aussie TV personality, married to another TV personality. I can't remember. I'll link it. I might mention it later when I've done some research. But documentary about this woman. I can hear my partner yelling the name of this documentary, the name of this woman in the documentary, because she knows exactly what I'm talking about. It's an hour and a half long documentary about
miscarriage,
her experiences with miscarrying, and just trying to at least open the conversation about it.
Yeah,
because it happens way more regularly than a lot of people would like to recognise. Very
common that even first-time pregnancies will end in an early miscarriage. Yeah, it's the stats are incredibly high.
We had your husband, Dr. Rob, on not long ago, and said just even for someone to successfully fall pregnant and carry that through to birth is a minor miracle in itself.
100%.
Yeah.
I don't remember feeling a sense of shame about the miscarriage I had. I remember disappointment, but I don't remember feeling like I was responsible. I hadn't done anything wrong. I just felt disappointment. But I also had a live child at that stage. So I knew that I had the potential to be able to have another live child. Maybe that makes it different. I'm not the expert in miscarriage on any level, other than I had one very early on, and I don't have huge trauma around that. And that's not saying that women don't have huge trauma around that, because I know many friends that have massive trauma around that. I've got enough trauma happening in other areas.
Got enough to go around. Yes. Last question before we jump over to our interview. We could keep talking about this forever. But I wanted to ask, we've now kind of brought up the reality that men are involved in this discussion because without the dude...
P&V, baby.
That's how this thing works. Mm-hmm. So to jump all the way back in this story, in your story...
Yep.
Where did this young gentleman play into any of this? Can you tell me a little bit about what happened there?
I only remember his first name. Like I said, it was a random hookup. I don't know anything about him. It was a meaningless event in my life that I wish had never happened. And at no point did I consult him or have any other communication with him in regards to what I would or wouldn't do. I never saw him again, never spoke to him again. Mate, I wish that shit never happened. Make that piece go away. So no, there was no Hollywood scene where I ring him and say, oh, darling, I've fallen pregnant. What should we do about it? No way, mate. It's got nothing to do with you.
Yeah.
I should have masturbated. If you'd only just pulled yourself.
We're going to devote an entire episode later on to masturbation, yes. So we'll dive into that as well.
I've got a headache just thinking about that.
So, following on from that, I've had recent discussions with other male friends of mine about this issue, about what role should, within consenting, loving relationships where all of a sudden there's a pregnancy, discounting unconsensual pregnancies, which are an entirely different issue, but within consensual relationships where there is a pregnancy, what role the guy has to play when we begin to have the discussion about abortion. And it is in my experience, an especially inflammatory idea, because there's a tension here between a woman's right to bodily autonomy, right? But also that which in my understanding of the way the world works is unquestionable. A woman always has, or should always have, total control over the choices they make over their body, right? But within a loving consensual relationship, should the father have a voice in whether or not she gets an abortion? It's a really, really tough question, because it's one of those things where you can talk about it theoretically, but until you find yourself, until the rubber hits the tarmac, and all of a sudden you find it, and this isn't a situation I found myself in, but I know people that have, all of a sudden it becomes a totally different discussion, because it's not theoretical anymore. No, you're now thinking, I might be a dad.
Yep.
I should have a say. And I don't have a good answer for it.
Well, I've got a story for that. A client of mine fell pregnant with triplets.
Wow.
They already had another child, and they fell pregnant with triplets, and they made a decision that they weren't going to cope with triplets. So they had a procedure done where one of the triplets was aborted mid-pregnancy, and so they ended up only having twins. And I remember the conversations around that and the trauma around that for her. Which one do they pick? And she ended up the doctor just had to make the decision on the day in regards to position. And that's how the choice was made. But even for her, and now so many years later, there's trauma and grief around that for her. Massive. She lives with that trauma daily as she looks into the eyes of her twins, because there's somebody missing. And that's what she shares. And it's not something she shares with everybody. And there's shame around that as well. But the husband and the wife made that choice together. So he was heavily involved in that.
Yeah. I guess, and this might be nitpicking on my part, but I feel very strongly, if I can, apologies, I just hit the microphone, if I can share my own stance on this, and this isn't me prescribing anything, but I feel very strongly that, like, and I think that, to use this example, of course this husband has to play a 50% role in this discussion. But at the end of the day, short of being forcibly picked up and dragged into a hospital to have the procedure, it is 100% down to the mother.
Yep.
To have to actually physically get this procedure followed through on. And I think that might seem like a pedantic little detail, as opposed to, no, it is, a joint arrangement. I think, yes, but I think there's an important distinction there that, like, at the end of the day, it is the woman's body, and it is not up to, at the end of the day, it is the woman's body, and to actually physically get up and go in and consent to the procedure, that is 100% down to the woman. And I think that isn't an issue, that distinction, within most relationships, within consenting, mutual, self-giving relationships. But when that distinction isn't clear, I think that is where, control and gaslighting and abuse and where those imbalances in the relationship can happen, when the man thinks that they actually have control over what the woman does with her body.
Yep. Thanks for saying that, Jonty. It's powerful hearing that out of a man.
And again, I say this knowing full well that I have no stake in this argument. I'm trying to humbly just speak on behalf of roughly 50% of the population that, socially, we do have a part to play in this discussion. But when it comes down to it, it is not our body.
I think it'd be amazing if men would, in regards to Roe versus Wade, I think the whole idea of the government saying that you cannot have an abortion, but they're not prepared to provide the medical resources for the woman then having the child, regardless of whatever the circumstance is, whether it's consensual or rape or incest or whatever the situ is, or just doesn't want the child. What role does the man have to play in bringing up that child for the rest of its life? The burden sits with the mother for the rest of her life, but he just gets to walk away and dump his sperm in anybody he wants to without any consequence whatsoever. But she's not allowed to make a decision.
There's a slightly less informed and more gut level feeling that I have, and this is going to sound crude, but if you're a bloke and you're dumb enough to accidentally blow in a girl, you lost the right to have a say.
I love it.
Like, you made your choice / mistake. It's up to her now. You passed that responsibility on when you accidentally didn't pull out or didn't wear a condom.
Or we garnish your wage for the next 20
Sure,
years.
yeah.
Do you know what I mean? We take a good chunk to help mum raise kid and for the kid go to school, and you can just work your ass off to provide for that child.
Yeah, there's a level of responsibility that I see so often in this discussion. There's no responsibility before conception, but as soon as, she's pregnant, I now have, as a dude, I should have say. It's like, well, you should have had a say before when you decided to have unprotected sex.
Yep. And that's going to feed right into our sex before marriage.
Absolutely.
There's consequences for getting laid.
That's it. Anything else we want to cover? I think we've been pretty comprehensive. There's so many other things we could talk about, in terms of the ethics of abortion. And
of course.
Shall we briefly stop by the Bible? Let's see what the Bible has to say about abortion. it doesn't. Great, let's move on. So what we might do...
Hang on, Jonty, pulling you back. Thou shalt not kill.
Sure.
Okay?
Sure.
So I think, and that herein lies where we feel the guilt and the shame, because we know that we shall not kill, and aborting a human life is in fact killing that human life. So I see it from a Jesus perspective as you're killing a living part of God's creation. You're choosing to not continue with that life. I can't see theologically any other way to viewing that.
Yeah, and the where that becomes tricky is where we haven't decided to go down this road is the ethics of abortion.
Correct.
Is when life starts.
Correct.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But for me, and I can only speak for me, this is where I sit on that. But the best part about that is that I worship a God, Jesus Christ, who has saved me from myself and my own sin. And that is, my abortion is one of many sins in my life. And we should be very slow to chuck stones at others.
Yeah.
Look deeply at our own sin before we start casting shame and guilt and judgment on women having abortions.
100%.
Yeah, what are you up to, peeps? What is your own sin? Pull that shit out of your own eye, mate, because I'm thinking there's stuff going down there that you're just keeping locked away in your own little cupboard. So I think theologically, it's not a good thing, and that's why we feel bad about it. That's why we're left feeling horrendous about it, because we know that it's not a great thing, that we're ending a potential life. Yeah.
Totally.
And that's not dealing with the ethical piece, and that's a whole nother discussion.
Yeah. Which, if people really want,
we can go
we're
there.
happy to dive into, but we figured there's enough for us to discuss
now,
before that.
Yeah,
so.
In my undergraduate degree, I did a killer essay on the ethics of abortion. It's that
really?
the topic that I covered.
We'll have to crack it out. Let's do it.
Oh, really? There'll be words I don't know, Jonty.
Well, this has been incredible. Let's shift gears a little bit now. We're going to hear from... do you want to introduce who we're going to hear from?
Yeah, sure. We're actually going to hear from Ginger, who is a New South Wales solicitor, registered to practice in the High Court, and she is actually my daughter. And so she is very passionate about Roe versus Wade. She's also an American citizen. So
really?
yes,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, because her dad's American, so she carries a dual passport. So she's very passionate about this law and what's actually happened. She's followed it deeply. So having a discussion with her is going to be excellent. I'm going to bow out of the interview and leave that completely with you, Jonty. But be sure to ask her. She knows about my abortion at 21, so ask her those questions. I'd be interested to see how she feels.
Definitely, will do. I'll see you on the other side.
See you then.
Ginger, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for joining us. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I feel honoured to be a guest on this amazing podcast.
Oh, thanks for coming. We really appreciate it. So for our listeners, do you want to just explain a little bit about who you are and maybe why we've asked you to come on to talk about this?
So my understanding is as to why I've been asked to be on this amazing podcast today is that we are discussing the Roe V Wade case and abortion. And I guess my knowledge is somewhat relevant, maybe not in the context of the United States, but I am a solicitor who practices law in New South Wales. I'm admitted to the High Court and the Supreme Court. Now, I do practice in family law, but I do have a very keen interest in the United States and what happens there. One, because I'm a woman and what's happened affects women, but also I'm a US citizen. So it's something that feels very real to me, despite the fact that I live in another country.
So for my benefit, but also for listeners' benefit who may not fully know, I'm sure will have heard the phrase Roe v Wade a lot over the last little while. Do you want to just explain a little bit about what that is and why it's important? why we need to be talking about it. Yeah.
I think we've all heard the names Roe v Wade coming out of the United States, particularly recently. But I think for the listeners to really grasp the magnitude and how significant what has happened recently and how important that is, it's important to go back in time about 50 years to when this case actually did first hit the courts. So traveling back to 1973, we've got what's called a landmark decision of the United States Supreme Court, where they ruled that the US Constitution granted the right to access and have an abortion. This case in the Supreme Court was brought by a woman named Norma McCorvey. Now, she became known as Jane Roe for the purposes of the court proceedings. So that's how we get the Roe v Wade. Now, a bit of context on Norma was that she was pregnant with her third child. She wanted to have an abortion, but she lived in Texas, where at the time it was illegal to actually have an abortion, to have access to such a service, except in circumstances where it was actually required to save a woman's life. Now, I think it's also important to understand here that in the US, states had the power to regulate the interests of the people that live within their state, right? However, that power is limited by the Constitution, but only in terms of what the Constitution actually governs. So the limit that was addressed in Roe v. Wade was the right to liberty. So the legal team for Jane Roe, who is Norma McCorvey, who I was talking about before, argued that the Constitution protected her right to liberty to choose to have an abortion, which was above a state's right to actually regulate abortion. So the outcome of the case was that the court ruled that a woman has a right to liberty, being the right to control whether or not she was actually pregnant, and that this outweighed the state's interests in a fetus's life up until a certain point of a pregnancy. Now, the court ruled that that was at the point of viability, and that means that when a fetus can survive outside the womb on its own. But after that point of viability, the state's interest in protecting the fetus then outweighed the woman's choice to terminate her pregnancy right. So we have the outcome of Roe v. Wade in 1973. Women can access abortion. It's outlined in the Constitution through the right to liberty. However, only up until a certain point, right? Now, I think another bit of context, which is important so we can understand what's actually happened in June last month, is that the Supreme Court has 9 justices. Now, these justices, in my understanding, are appointed by the president, and it's the highest court in the land. So it'd be about the equivalent of our High Court in Australia. Now, the decisions by the 9 justices are made by voting, and the majority decision obviously wins. There's 9, it's an uneven number, so decisions are made, right? Now we get to the really difficult part of what just happened in June last month. We fast forward almost 50 years from when this decision was made in 1973. And on the 25th of June, we saw the right to abortion be overturned by the Supreme Court due to the majority decision, the majority vote of the justices voting to overturn that landmark decision, right? Now, something that I really need to just vent on with you, Jonty, is that the ironic thing here is that the Supreme Court, right, are determining the rights of a woman to have an abortion. There's 9 people doing that, affecting all the women in the United States. However, only 3 of those justices actually have a uterus and are biologically geared to actually carry a baby. But the worst part here is that out of those 3 women, 1 actually voted to overturn that case. So we've got 9 justices who are responsible for the overturning of a woman's right to abortion and to access that. We actually have a woman who's actually, I feel like, has turned against us and has played a very significant role in that occurring. But I hope that made sense. I just think it was important to really go through the history, how it works, and then what's happened now.
Yeah, of course. That's incredibly helpful. And I guess a question that I've seen a lot coming up online and within my own sort of circles as well is, well, this happened in the US. So what's the flow on effect? Like, how does that affect us here in Australia?
So I guess in Australia, it's not too dissimilar. We actually don't have a constitutional right to access abortion in Australia. It's governed by our states and territories. So similar to what we saw in the US, I guess, following Roe v Wade. So our states actually have the power to determine a woman's access to abortion. Now, I guess the good news in Australia is that it's been decriminalised in every state, so it's no longer a criminal offence to actually access and have an abortion, except for Western Australia, which is actually outlined in their criminal code. I obviously live in New South Wales, so I'm not overly familiar with Western Australia. But I guess, in New South Wales, you can definitely access abortion without having any medical exemption up to 22 weeks. But then after that point in time, you have to have 2 doctors approve you to do that procedure. But I guess the concerning thing here and the flow-on effects that it could have on Australia is that we've seen the people in power in the United States totally turn on their head and totally change a woman's right to have access to that abortion, right? However, in Australia, that could very much happen here as well. That's the scary thing. And I think we have a Minister for Women in Australia. Her name's Katie Gallagher, and I think she puts it into great perspective. She was interviewed by ABC Radio following the overturning of the overturning of Roe v Wade back in June. And she said this: "I think the message to me from that decision in America was the need to remain vigilant, because hard fought for wins before our parliament can be easily taken away." So I guess the flow-on effect here is that we really don't know what's going to happen. It's very possible that something like this could happen, but we would hope, as we do have legislation in our states, such as in New South Wales, the Abortion Law Reform Act of 2019, we do have legislation and it has been decriminalised. We obviously hope that we don't see a regression in our rights like we did just see in the United States, but what we can do is pray and cross our fingers, essentially, and just hope that the people in power make the right decisions for our people.
And you mentioned earlier, off camera, you were particularly worried about what this means, having what is clearly a more conservative bunch of people in power.
Yeah.
And now that this has been overturned, the chances of other things and more things changing over the course of the next little while. Did you want to just talk about that a little bit? And yeah.
So I think at the moment, as you know, going back to us just talking about the 9 justices of the Supreme Court. So as I said before, it's the president in power who gets the power to elect and appoint those justices. So during Donald Trump's time, we saw him get quite a few opportunities, or the power really, to appoint different justices. And obviously, as he is a Republican, he's more of a conservative position, or he is a very conservative position, I should say. And I think we've seen people like Amy Barrett come into power in the Supreme Court, who is a conservative, and that's the woman who actually voted to overturn Roe v Wade, right? But the concerning thing about the people that we have in power in the United States in those courts right now is that we have other key cases and other landmark cases which could be overturned as well. It was actually one of the justices, Clarence Thomas, who wrote in his opinion when he wrote what should happen with Roe v Wade, he called for the court to overrule the rulings on the rights to contraception, same-sex intimacy, and same-sex marriage. And those landmark cases are Griswold in Connecticut. You might have heard about these I obviously have, because I've been reading heavily on it. But you've got Griswold in Connecticut, which is the right to contraception, Lawrence in Texas, which is the right to same-sex intimacy, and then Obergefell and Hodges, which is the right to same-sex marriage. So the issue here is we've got a lot of conservative judges in power at the moment in that Supreme Court, outnumbering the number of Democratic appointed judges. And I guess the risk now is that we've got other landmark cases which protect very important rights that people have really fought for in the history of the United States, that now, I guess, are on a limb here, and we don't know what could happen, but it's very possible we could see those cases be overturned in the next amount of time, I guess.
And I guess for me, I always struggle with this, like a lot of people, when they think Christian, they think those old white conservative dudes.
Yeah.
That seems to be the public perception of what Christianity looks like in a political setting. Which just, it troubles me because as is evidenced by our conversation today, we're two Christians and we obviously feel very differently. And it's, I think it's scary for a whole stack of reasons. But
I think, like you were saying, we're two Christians here who are just absolutely gobsmacked that this could happen, right? But at the same time, I think that there's obviously different approaches to how people interpret the Bible too. But I always just sit here and I think, if the God that I love and the God that I pray to and believe in with every inch of my being in is so against people living their life happily, using contraception, marrying the person that they love because they're gay, good on them. They need to have an abortion because it's necessary for their financial circumstances, for their mental health, for their physical health. I just struggle to think that the God we all believe and love would ostracize those people for doing something that they really, really are passionate about, right? And I just look off tangent here, but I always think, in particular in relation to the matter of same-sex marriage, I never once, John, you'll be able to comment here. I don't remember ever once saying to myself as a person that, I'm attracted to men, because I don't remember ever making that conscious decision, right? I just know that I am. So I just sit here and I think, I truly believe that we are how we are as God made us to be. And I would hate to think that the God we all love and pray to and worship would ostracize people because of something that they need to do for their own mental health and their own physical safety, right?
Yeah, totally. And I think to follow that tangent a little bit, the just with the same-sex thing, whenever I see religious belief being expressed as changing people's behavior, as if your physical attraction to whoever it is that you're physically attracted to is a choice, because I think you're exactly right. I never at any point in my life growing up as a heterosexual man decided, what, I'm going to be attracted to women. I always was like,
right.
And my gay friends have always been attracted to who they've been attracted to, and that's a beautiful thing. And I think a lot of this comes down to, and I'd be really curious to sit down in a room with these 9 people and actually talk to them one-on-one, because and this applies to so many different issues, but everything can be abstract and everything can be just theoretical, but until you actually meet someone that has to go through the real life of it, until the rubber hits the ground. So I just wonder how many of these 9 people know anyone that has had to have an abortion for their financial well-being or for whatever it is, I
think, my mom had an abortion at 6 weeks, obviously before both my sister and I were born, and I just think to myself, and my mum is very open about it, and we see the long-term effects that abortion does have on a woman and on the man, of course. Obviously, if that's the circumstances, it's horrendous. And I think that God knew what needed to happen in my mum's life, and she wasn't in a position to be having a baby at that point in time. But should she had gone through with that pregnancy at the same time, my sister and I wouldn't be here. She wouldn't, she wouldn't be married to my dad. And I just think God knows exactly what needs to happen in our life. But John T, I think something else, like you were saying, we're two Christians who are sitting here saying that essentially that pro-choice, right? But I also think, do you often get, when you say you're a Christian, I know that particularly recently, when I talk about being Christian, they always say, oh, so you're pro-life then. So, well, I just think a woman should have the right to be able to determine what needs to happen over her body. I think that, I don't know, as a woman, I know I can comment on this because I have the right, bits to be able to have a baby, but I just think that no woman would ever, 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 ever consider having an abortion as a means for birth control. It's just illogical. It's just not something that a woman would ever put herself through and suffer for the rest of her life with, for the sake of birth control. Women don't make that decision lightly. I just can't foresee that being something that a woman just goes, oh, I'm just going to go and do this now. Well, no, it's not like that. I feel like they've just, punished women and completely ostracized them and just made them fearful for their life, because women will still get abortions in the United States. Women will just go underground and do it, illegally if they're in a state that it's criminalized, right? And I just think just means that it'll just cause stress for them, but also it could really endanger their physical health, and it could be really life-threatening. So I just think they're just, for lack of a better word, they've just really fucked up, really.
Totally. And I think that there's this weird thing where people assume that pro-choice equals pro-abortion.
Yeah.
Anyone is pro-abortion.
Agreed.
And yeah, the idea that pro-choice is, go and have abortions for child birth control, exactly like you just said, is just a fallacy. Like, it's not true.
Absolutely.
And I think I might have already mentioned this is in my conversation with Ness, so I apologize if I'm repeating myself here, but the conversation can't even begin to happen often because pro-life and pro-choice are actually about two different issues. One is about human rights and one is about women's rights and bodily autonomy. And until it's just two different arguments arguing about different things. And so until we find common ground, and I think we find common ground through hearing stories from people with real life experiences. Was there anything else that you had that you wanted to touch on?
No, I don't think so. I just think ultimately, I think there's a difference between, like you said, no, I don't believe anyone is pro-abortion. I don't think it's a decision people make lightly. And I think that ultimately people, there's significant consequences that follow through from having an abortion on a woman's mental health, the physical changes that happen to their body as well following a procedure like that. But just hope we live to see a day where we do get people in power who believe that women do have a right to make choices over things that affect their body. Because right now we have a group of people who can't even, carry a baby, who are determining whether a woman should be able to access that. And it's just crazy. Just we're living in a crazy world, but we've got to keep praying and pushing through and hoping that one day we do see a light at the end of the tunnel here. Because right now it feels like we're at the start of the tunnel and it's never ending.
Yeah, and as long as I have a platform, I'm going to keep saying this, but unless you have a uterus, you need to just take a backseat on this one. Like, it's as simple as that. I
think it's really good to hear from men as well, though. I think that obviously it's the woman who carries the baby, but I think, talking to a man about it like yourself, Jonty, it's really refreshing to see, someone who understands and who really empathizes with women too. So keep sharing your voice too, because women need to hear it right now. It's a very dark time, especially for women who are living it as their reality in the US right now.
Yeah, totally. It's I'm scared for people, especially like I said before, when the rubber hits the road, it becomes a lot more real and you have to actually put what you think theoretically into practice. And I think anyone with real life experience with anyone in their circles or that they know that has to actually confront this stuff comes at it from a much more empathetic and understanding perspective. So I guess that's just
I think it's
most people. Yeah.
Also, I think just a similar context, or not similar, just like a similar anecdote there is, I guess, that in similar circumstances like sexual assault, people, I think you can always see, we see all this rhetoric about what a woman was wearing, short skirt, she was asking for it, all that bullshit. But I think, like, unless you know someone who has been sexually abused, or someone who has had an abortion, or someone who has had to contemplate an abortion, you really have no idea. I just think the empathy is the best path to take in all circumstances, to try and understand where someone's coming from if you can't relate directly. I think empathy is not a difficult thing, but it surprises me sometimes how difficult it can be for people to try and put themselves in someone else's shoes. So I think we have to do that, because otherwise we're just going to be hurting someone, and we don't know what we're going to be casting onto someone if we are being cruel or judgmental.
Yeah, especially I see it online all the time. It's so easy just to drop a comment and then walk away and never see. I mean, you haven't even seen them face to face anyway, but it's so easy to just get into an argument online, drop a comment about what you believe, and then not face the consequences about what that does. Absolutely.
We see it every day, right? Social media is nasty, very nasty place.
Whenever I see, especially with the Roe V Wade stuff, I see let's say heated discussion happening online, I just go, in what universe are we going to solve this in a Facebook comment thread?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Can we stop, guys?
Yeah. Join an advocacy group. Do something, use this time that you're spending posting on posts that are going nowhere. Use that time to advocate, to, join a group, to share your awareness, join support groups for people. I think there's so many other things you could be doing with that time other than arguing with people online who you're it's not going to make a change. I think.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed, though. We can always hope for a better world. Maybe one day we'll see it in our lifetime, though.
Yeah, we can only hope, I guess. Yeah. Thanks so much for joining us on the podcast. I've had a blast talking to you. It's been really informative for me.
No, thank you for having me, Jonty. It's been fantastic. I feel like I love the podcast so much, so I was very excited to be asked to be on it. And I hope my information has, like you said, been informative, and I've been able to help expand your knowledge on the area.
Yeah, you're more than welcome back anytime. Love to have you again. Thanks so much.
No, thanks, Jonty.
Wow, that was huge. Hey, Jonty. Thanks, Ginger. That was amazing. So much to discuss. Such a massive topic. Let's now wrap our podcast today with some gratitude. Cue the music, Jonty. What are you grateful for, brother?
All right, well, this is another one that I've had in my back pocket for a little while. We're talking to each other on a podcast. I, over the last few years, have gotten really into listening to podcasts. Have I ever talked to you about my favourite band before, Ness?
No, mate.
Okay, so my favourite band has been my favourite band since I was about 14 or 15, I think, when I discovered them for the first time, is a band called Under Oath. I discovered them, and I'll quickly tell you the story about how I discovered them. I was, like I said, I think 13 or 14, actually, maybe a little bit younger. Discovered music with screaming in it and heavy, loud, angry music, and suddenly got really into it. I remember I don't even remember what the album was. Came home, had been to the movies with some mates in the holidays or something, and stopped by JB Hi-Fi and bought some CD. I don't remember what it was. And Dad goes, who I love, and our music tastes are very different, and that's fine. But I think a bit confronting. I don't remember what the album was, but it was some heavy metal record. And I come home with this CD. Oh, what have you got there? And I showed it to him. Don't you have enough of those? Which,
Go, Dave.
when you're that age, I think it's that forbidden fruit thing as well. Like, if something has been deemed a no-go zone, that's what you want to do. So I dove right into this sort of like subgenre of music, which a lot of the time is lyrically and visually very confronting, right? And a youth group leader of mine at the time discovered that I was listening to this music, who I then discovered also loved this style of music. And shout out if you're listening. I won't say your name because I don't know if you're happy being on the podcast, but we're still great mates today. And says, you need to listen to X, Y, and Z. He gave me a list of artists, which at the time I didn't realise he was doing the thing that any good youth group leader does, which is giving you Christian alternatives.
Without screaming.
With screaming.
Oh.
With screaming. So
Jesus screaming.
One of these bands was a band called Under Oath. And I discovered them and was like, oh my God. And genuinely actually was a big moment for me in coming to realise that art and music and expressions, creative expressions, can be angular and dark and a little bit edgy, and that's okay, and not to separate that from faith and spirituality. Like it's a if you know the history of Under Oath, it's actually a long story about their identity as a quote-unquote Christian band. That's a whole other thing. But discovering, these people love Jesus and they're creating this music which is really dramatic and exciting and angular and intriguing to me. So that's the whole thing. Cut to earlier this year, they released a new album, which is fantastic. One of the things that they always had done in the past, is released an hour-long documentary with each record of a behind-the-scenes.
I love that.
They're amazing. Every fan of any artist loves
Yep.
a peek behind the curtain, right? And I've always loved, because at that point you're forming, a bit of a one-way relationship with the people as well as...
Yeah.
This time, with this new record, there are 10 songs in the record. For each song, they have released a podcast that is anywhere between 1 to 2 hours long.
Whoa. So
since January, we just got the 9th episode 24 hours ago or less when we're recording this. So over the course of this year, I have been getting the best in-depth discussion of not just the creation of this album, but the history behind it and the relationships that informed the different decisions, the behind-the-scenes stuff related to the art direction and the visual element of the record, all these different things across what's now almost 10 hours, right?
Amazing.
And I just think it is the coolest thing ever.
It just makes you love it all the more.
Exactly,
doesn't it?
exactly. And I already think that Under Oath are one of the more forward-thinking and exciting bands working in that world anyway.
Do you feel like they're your friends because you get to know them that well?
Well, funny you say that. Well, I've actually had direct contact with 2 of the guys in this band already. One of which was through my mate Dan, if you're listening, g'day. Had direct contact with Aaron Gillespie, who's the drummer and singer. He does some singing. Actually sent some music from the project that we're working on together to him.
Love that.
And we got a response.
Wow.
Said he loved it and he cheekily said, I can tell you're a fan of Under Oath. I was like, stuck up prick. But also I've had direct contact with Chris Dudley, who's also not only in Under Oath, but also is a film composer.
Wow.
So I feel like I feel like if you were to tell 14-year-old me that this band and this handful of records that I loved would lead to not only more and more records, but an ongoing creative, almost reciprocal relationship,
Yeah.
I think I'd be pretty stoked to hear that.
Totally.
To the point where now, like, if at some point, I've just heard today that an Australian band that I love called Thornhill have been fucked over by Qantas travelling internationally, and they've had to cancel shows because they don't know where any of their gear is. So international travel and shows is still, in this COVID-19 world, a thing. If Under Oath were to come to Australia, getting a support act in our band supporting Under Oath, opening for them, would be a really, really great full circle kind of thing.
Oh my wow.
So almost power of manifestation. Now it's out there on the internet, Under Oath. Anyway, I'll
Yes.
If they next time
Kind of
they
a
announce,
backstage pass?
yeah, I'll get. I feel like our guest list might be pretty minimal at that point. Yeah. So I don't know, and the other thing is like that this album, and this actually plays into I don't know if I've told you about this, but when we at Uniting Heart and Soul needed to do online church for the first time, this was a whole thing with my role here, is coming to terms with what online church could look like in a way that's exciting in and of itself, not just as a replacement for in-person church.
Or nose cam, as I call it.
Nose cam, or even just like the single camera on a tripod at the back of the room.
Yep.
And you just do church as you normally would. I just, it fills a role, but as its own thing. Under Oath were one of the first artists to... Not one of the first, but one of the first major artists to do it well in a way that grabbed a lot of attention, performing live in a live stream setting in a way that wasn't just them on stage with a camera and a tripod at the back of the room. And in a way that you buy a ticket
to watch.
And you watch it live.
Wow.
And the way that it was presented was exciting and worth the price of admission, in the same way that when you buy a ticket to a live show, there's something that you expect and want to get out of it.
And was it a part of the church context?
No, not at all. This is just, you buy a ticket to an Under Oath show, but instead of going out to, the Metro in Sydney, you watch it at home.
See. Oh, yeah.
You watch it at home. So that actually, seeing what they were able to do in a quote-unquote live stream setting really informed how I thought about doing online church.
Yeah.
And this new record that they did, as well as releasing it. A month before this album came out, you could buy a ticket to watch them play the new album front to back live. That's
incredible.
Which I think is it's the coolest shit ever, because the balls it takes to play a record live that hasn't even been released yet to a paid ticketed audience. You can't see. Yeah. Right? As performers, you can't see, there's no interaction with crowd.
No.
Yeah.
Very different performance style too.
Totally. And so I'm not going to try and explain it, but if you go and watch the live shows initially were this thing called The Observatory. You can go and find that, but the new record live stream is a thing called Digital Ghost. If you're interested,
stick it in our
if
show
you're
notes.
interested, go and check it out, even if you're not interested in that style of music, because as a production and as a live stream, so inspiring. That on top of 10 hours of podcasts just going into the...
Makes you love them.
Yeah.
It's very clever marketing. Love it.
Unbelievable.
And they scream about Jesus.
Well, not anymore. No. Even when they were a quote-unquote Christian band, they didn't really scream about Jesus. That was part of their appeal. That's a whole other thing, the history of Under Oath as a Christian band.
Yeah, interesting.
So yeah, I'm incredibly grateful for all of that. It's a lot. But,
Amen.
Yeah.
It's good. I can see your face glowing. Makes you happy.
Oh, just if in 18 months' time when Under Oath finally come to Australia again,
you're taking a day off.
I'll be taking the week off for rehearsals.
The week off.
For rehearsals, because we'll be supporting them.
Oh, that's right. I'll be your chaplain. I'll be your roadie chaplain.
Yeah, we'll bring you on the road. That about does it. I feel like I talked way too long about a band that no one else gives a shit about, but...
Oh, they will now. They'll go and have a look.
Yeah.
It's good. Thanks for that, Jonty.
Yeah, no worries. I don't know what order these are coming out in, so I'm sure next week will be something exciting, but we will be continuing to discuss sexuality and intimacy in the same way that we've been doing so far. We hope you've been getting something out of it, and if you have, feel free to get in touch.
Give us your feedback.
Yeah, we already have a fair amount of feedback that I'm going to, at the end of this series, we'll do a mailbag episode where we'll just read out and respond to and discuss all the messages that you've been sending. So keep sending them in.
Some people really hate my language.
Yeah.
They get upset.
Yeah.
And I warn them, Jonty. Warning. She might say stuff that'll upset you.
Here's my issue though, right? And we might revisit this for Event Central. We might revisit this for a whole episode. If you're more offended by the word fuck than you are let's say your child abuse, for example.
Yeah.
If you're more offended by the word fuck
than what I'm saying about my child abuse,
you really need to revisit how you feel about language and taking offense to things, because I think that's so backwards. But
I'll pray for them.
Yeah, it's just gets me annoyed.
Yeah,
gets me annoyed.
Me too. Breathe. I'm Vanessa.
And I'm Jonty. This is the Filthy Hope Podcast. We will see you next time. Thanks for listening. We know that it was a longer one this week, so thanks for sticking with us as we made our way through a very tough topic. The documentary I was struggling to remember was Misunderstandings of Miscarriage, and the subject of that documentary is Tahina McManus. I'll link that down below with the other films that we mentioned during the podcast. If you want to support us here at the podcast, feel free to do any of the things that you're able to on the platform that you're listening on. Like, comment, leave a 5-star review, even just share it with a friend. Next week, we're actually going to be taking a break from Love, Sex and Jesus to have a quick mid-season intermission by looking at another film. We're going to be watching Heaven is For Real and having a chat about that with a guest, all about miracles and heaven. So feel free to catch up on watching Heaven is For Real before then, but like the last film review we did with First Reformed, you won't need to have seen the film to understand the conversation or get anything out of it. We will be spoiling everything about the film though, so if you want to see it unspoiled, make sure that you do see it before listening to next week's episode. As always, you can find us on socials or get in touch more directly by emailing us at filthyhopepod@gmail.com. We'll see you next week when we dive into Heaven is For Real, but until then, take Jesus seriously and don't be a dick.